Okay, so Associate Professor Elizabeth Tynan is the coordinator of the Professional Development Program at the James Cook University Graduate Research School. She teaches academic writing, editing and critical thinking skills. She's a former science journalist and her PhD from the ANU examined aspects of the British nuclear tests in Australia and the 50s and 60s. Her book, called Atomic Thunder, The Maralinga Story, won the Council of Humanities, Arts and Social Science Prize in 2017 and also the Prime Minister's Literary Award in 2017 in the subject of Australian history. Her follow-up book titled The Secret of Emu Field was published in 2022. And this book investigates the history of the lesser-known British atomic test site in Australia, South Australia, Emu Field. Be warned, she started researching her next book on the British atomic test, which were held at Western Australia's Montebello Islands. So, with the topic, Dangerous Games, Nuclear Colonialism in Australia, we welcome Associate Professor Dr Elizabeth Tynan.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. And I just want to say how much I enjoyed Michael's talk before. I'm so sorry I wasn't here for earlier talks. I just wanted to, there were two issues arising from Michael's talk that I just wanted to quickly mention. First of all, he mentioned John Carver, who I knew quite well actually from the ANU. But what I find particularly interesting is that John Carver was, when he was a young postdoc, straight out of his PhD from Cambridge, he actually worked at Emu Field, working with Ernest Titterton, taking measurements on neutron flux and other measurements at the Operation Totem tests in 1953. So that was very interesting. Michael also mentioned Blue Danube, which of course is a very important British bomb design by Sir William Penny. William Penny, the mathematical physicist. The Royal Air Force did not like the name Blue Danube and called it a Ministry of Supply name. And their name for the bomb was actually the Small Boy, which I personally think is quite confusing when you think of other weapons that have similar names. So I'm just going to share my screen. This is always a dangerous moment as I figure out whether I've selected the right screen. Just bear with me for a moment. You will initially see a Word document until I get the right. Just bear with me for 1 second, if you don't mind, while I just manage my two monitors. Now, just bear with me. Can someone please indicate whether you can see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. This image that you can see on the screen now is actually sunrise at.
Sorry, we can see the Word document.
Oh, you can see the Word document. Just 1 second. How's that?
Good.
Okay, thank you very much. The two monitors always cause me confusion. So anyway, we're there now. Okay, now you can see an image on the screen, which is sunrise at Maralinga. Just under 3 years ago when I was there, and that was the day that I travelled from Maralinga to the Emu Field site, which is just under 200 kilometres to the north of Maralinga. It was a pretty amazing day as we negotiated the rather tricky road up to Emu Field, which is still under a restricted area, and you have to get permission from the Department of Defence, which I was able to do, fortunately, as well as from Maralinga Jarratjar Council. So I just want to talk, and I don't have a lot of time, and it's such a huge story. But I just want to begin with this quote from James McClelland, Diamond Jim McClelland, who was the head of the Royal Commission into British nuclear tests in Australia. As you know, that was a Royal Commission that was held in mid-1980s, 1984, 85. It travelled all around the place, all around Australia, and it also took its proceedings to London. And in his report, which is a particularly interesting, well-written, rather angry report, he says that Australia became the oval on which Britain's nuclear game was to be played, which hints at some of the power imbalance, I think, that was evident in this story, and which I continue to see in the documentation that I'm able to view. I've just not long ago come back from London, which is why I've got a croaky voice from the bronchitis I picked up over there. I have, in pursuit of my next book on the Montebello tests, Hurricane and Mosaic, I have been viewing quite a bit of new documentation that I haven't previously seen. It's amazing how big this story is, that even 2 books in, and I still feel I've just scratched the surface. Just how that power imbalance played out, how there was a sense of obligation from Australia. It would be wrong to say that that was the entire motivation. Of course, these things are very complex, and Robert Menzies had many reasons to say yes without consulting cabinet in 1950 to beginning the process of Operation Hurricane. So yeah, it's a complex picture, but certainly in the actual on-the-ground interaction between the British authorities and the Australian authorities, it was pretty evident who was in charge and who was calling the shots, and just how little Australia actually asked, how few questions they actually asked. And I think a lot of those, the problems that were caused by that power imbalance are still being played out. And I'll mention that as we go along. So I have subtitled my talk today mentioning the term nuclear colonialism, which is a relatively recent term, actually from the 1990s, but I believe that it does fit with what we're talking about here. So it refers to a global hierarchy in which nuclear armed countries transfer the risks of atomic testing onto countries and populations lower down the pecking order, you might say, generally to colonies or former colonies or to their own Indigenous peoples. And the term was only coined in the 1990s by the US anti-nuclear weapons testing activist Jennifer Vierak, who said who defined it as the taking or destruction of other people's natural resources, lands and well-being for one's own in the furtherance of nuclear development. And I think we are seeing I don't think that the backlash against what happened is diminishing at all. If anything, it is growing. There are various projects underway at the moment for some sort of justice, some sense of justice in particularly the wrongs committed against Indigenous people, whether within Australia or in the Pacific and other places as well. So I think that this is actually a growing movement. I'm seeing quite a bit more movement around this topic. And there's also, as I'll mention later, legal issues still arising, and there's a very interesting one going on at the moment playing out in the UK, which I'll mention as well in a moment. But physically, the UK could have tested its weapons on its own territory, and it did seriously consider that. From the Shetlands and Hebrides area, it was actually looking quite seriously at testing there. But this was very quickly knocked on the head as politically impossible. So it searched through former territories for test sites. Australia was not the first choice, notwithstanding the infrastructure that had already started with the joint project and Woomera and so on. But in fact, through the documents that I've seen, there is still, you can see that Britain was still trying to find somewhere else other than Australia, right up until not only the moment of hurricane in 52, but even Totem, when they moved to Emu Field in 53, you could see that there was still a lot of back channels going on to try and get the Americans to repeal parts of the McMahon Act. And there was, you know, other options being canvassed because Australia was not ideal in some ways. Originally, they wanted Canada, as some of you would know. Canada was right at the top of the list in the 40s, but that didn't pan out for various reasons. And Australia was by no means seen as the ideal choice at all. Now, Australia certainly had agency in its decision-making. This is not a simple story of a colonial power imposing its will upon a defenceless, subjugated country. It's nothing like that at all. But I think there is a subtle effect here of the weight of colonial history bearing down upon the individual decision makers, which made everyone curiously unable to deal effectively with the, in Australia, among the Australian politicians and Australian authorities. They didn't seem to know how to ask the right questions, to make the right requirements or place requirements on the British authorities. And so I think that that has to do with the fact that Australia was a former colony and was behaving in some ways in a subservient way. Britain did promise an awful lot of data, information, you know, results from the tests, which were never forthcoming. And Australia was curiously unable to ask for them. Seemed impolite to do so. I have actually heard some people talk about it in those terms, that it seemed like it was not something that Australia was able to do. So there was this strange power imbalance, I think, between Australia and the UK. And for Britain's part, it is quite striking in the archival record to see the casual way it placed an obligation on Australia and then later walked away without a backward glance at the aftermath, until it was forced to do so by the Royal Commission in the mid-1980s. And that is an interesting story in itself, how the Royal Commission did extract, you know, with some resistance initially, certainly, some of the documents, by no means all, associated with what they did at the time. So there was, to my reading anyway, of the archival record, an imperial aloofness and a sense of entitlement in its dealings with Australia. And I've mentioned that its own territory was considered, and so were many other places as well. So you can see here an extract from a top secret letter that went from the UK Ministry of Supply through to the Commonwealth Relations Office, quoting Thomas Elmhurst, who was head of Totex, which was the Totem executive, which managed the Operation Totem, you know, lead up to that. He left soon after Totem finished. But you'll note that soon after that letter, so a few months later, it was announced in the House of Lords that no nuclear experiments would be held on UK soil. By then, of course, 3 atomic bombs had been exploded on Australian soil. Here's a now declassified but once secret guard image of Totem 1 at Emu Field, which I think is always quite a dramatic image. It was a fateful decision. It had profound implications for many people. Of course, the test particularly affected Aboriginal populations very profoundly, and also service personnel. There is a legal action currently underway, and when I was in London, I met up with some of the people involved in that action against the Ministry of Defence on behalf of those affected by the conduct of the tests, and specifically relating to the withholding of medical records from service personnel who were affected, which they are still, Ministry of Defence is still holding on to a lot of those records. So there's a legal case underway to extract those records and hold the Ministry of Defence responsible for harming people because people did not have access to their own health records. Now, I know we don't have a lot of time, and I can see how quickly the time's gone already, but I did just want to, because I'm an historian, I love talking about the people involved. And of course, there was Menzies with his various motives for saying yes to the British. Obviously, and Michael mentioned this, uranium resources in Australia were a big part of this story as well, which I don't have time to go into, but Michael covered so very well. Clement Attlee drove the early stages of the British bomb, of course. Frederick Lindemann, Lord Cherwell, played a very important role, including during the Attlee era, because he was on the relevant secret committees that drove the development of the weapon, and later as when Churchill came back to power in 1951 as his atomic bulldog, basically pushing this through and also taking a very dim view of the Americans. So he was very much interested in Britain being independent, creating its own weapon. And Ernest Titterton, who my father actually worked with at the ANU, the British physicist who headed up for a brief period the Atomic Weapons Test Safety Committee, which was notorious for keeping information from the Australian government. William Penny, the brilliant designer of Blue Danube and other weaponry for the British, managed several of the atomic weapons test series in Australia. And Yami Lester, who as a child was affected by the black mist that rolled over populations following Totem 1 in 1953, who later became a whistleblower and an advocate. A very important person in this story. Michael mentioned what happened with Operation Hurricane and the entry into the atomic club by Britain at number 3, 25 kiloton fission device detonated in the hull of a ship. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to talk very long about these at all, but Emu Field was a very, very important part of this story, often forgotten. And the 2 totem tests there in 1953 did untold damage. And it's possible to argue that it was more damage than Maralinga would do later to the Anangu people and the lands. Totem was a particularly nasty series of tests, not only the 2 mushroom clouds, but also the toxic trigger tests that were held there too, the Kittens series. And that's the clay pan at Emu where all the military planes used to land until they built another strip alongside it. It's the most dramatic looking place. Now, Maralinga, of course, which came after both Montebello and Emu, that's not from the lands. That's not an Anangu name. It comes from a Northern Territory extinct language, and it was applied to the site by a government committee. So that's another manifestation of the colonialism at the heart of this story. I think Michael might have shown this image, the airdrop of Buffalo 3, the Blue Danube device dropped by a V-bomber in October 1956. This was actually the only airdrop. All the others were on towers or on the ground or dropped from balloons. So I personally find that image quite chilling when I look at it. Now, wrapping up quickly, this is from my book, Atomic Thunder, and I thought you might like to just get a little bit of an insight into some of the aftermath of these tests. So in 2002, John Clark QC was appointed by Prime Minister John Howard to review veterans' entitlements, including those of nuclear veterans. Clark received 160 submissions on the British nuclear tests, and a chapter of the resulting report dealt exclusively with the veterans of the tests. Clark called nuclear tests a unique, extraordinary event in Australia's history, and found that members of the armed services were exposed to dangers beyond those normally experienced in peacetime. As one of the submissions to the inquiry put it, Australian servicemen were provided on loan to an experimental nuclear weapon test program under the control of another country without prior scientific examination, independent advice or assessment of the potential dangers that could occur. You'll see that image there. That is what's left of the swimming pool that the service personnel, roughly 30,000 or more service personnel who were stationed at Maralinga over the period of its operation, which was from 1956 until the last minor trial in 1963. That was a centre of their social life there, but now it's just a ruin, like so much at the site. The Royal Commission was damning. So the 1963 trials brought to an end a drama characterised by persistent deception and paranoid secrecy. In their desire to avoid international repercussions, the British authorities embarked on a course of determined concealment of information from the Australian government. That's something I'm very interested in, the fact that there was a disconnect between the two governments and the flow of information was very restricted for a number of reasons. The process of uncovering the long-term effects of the British tests was started by whistleblowers in the 1970s and continued through journalistic investigation and the Royal Commission and continues to this day. Many British files are still closed and historians and survivors still find it difficult to get to the heart of everything that was done in Australia. Some of us are trying very hard though. I'd just like to thank you for your attention. I apologise, I seem to have run a couple of minutes over time, which is not like me. I try to be on time. But thank you so much. That's another photo from the site with from Maralinga, me with a colleague when we visited a few years ago. But on that note, I will stop sharing and hand back to Jason. Thank you.
Well, it's not lunchtime. What an incredible treasure trove of knowledge and information we've learned already this morning. Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed for your time and your presentation. If you were here, we'd probably be able to give you a large bundle of books to take away, but that's just not possible. But again, we thank you and we'll show some appreciation again at the end of our session. It is time for us to ask our panellists, to ask Peter, Michael, David, and with the wonders of technology, Liz, to answer any question that you may have. Lunch is scheduled for about 12:30, and I'm sure that we can, we'll be as close to time as we possibly can. So with Liz, we may have to repeat the question. That'll be something we'll have to, I hope, with the wonders of technology. But I'm happy to take questions at this stage for any of the panellists. Yes, great.
Thanks, Darryl. My question is from to Liz. Can you hear me at all, Liz?
Yes, you can.
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. You make the remarkable and I think quite profound contention that it was the weight of Australia's colonial history that removed agency from Australia's decision makers and led to the testing you discussed. Given all we've heard about the strategic context going on and Menzies plans and others, why do you say that and not it was in Australia's own self-interest to do that? Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence?
Oh, it's a reasonable question. And I suppose I also tried to make the point that it was that Menzies' decision-making was not based on, being a sycophant or being subservient. In fact, he was motivated by, markets for uranium, post-war protection. He also, of course, wanted Australia to be a nuclear nation. However, I do think in the actual relationship between the two countries, it comes through in the documents that Australia was actually reticent to ask too many questions or appear to be pushing its own interests forward, that it was actually deferring to the British, and the British were actually quite arrogant in the way they spoke about the Australians and in their general dealings with the Australians, and they made many determinations about keeping things from the Australian government. So I think that there's a subtle effect there of the weight of colonial history, because UK, to many people at that time, was still the mother country. And that actually imbued a lot of the relationship, I believe.
Sorry, very quickly, could that not have been also a fact that nuclear technology was a highly classified and close-hold issue? I mean, other than that, is it just the vibe of the correspondence you made?
The British promised Australia nuclear information that it had no intention of sharing. And it couldn't really share because of agreements it had with the Americans as well. So, so Australia was madly, trying to determine whether it could itself become a nuclear nation, and went a fair way down that path, as you know.
Thank you.
But it was always reticent to push Britain on that issue. And in the end, it just folded. The Australian government, Menzies, they just refused to stand up and say, you have promised us these things and you haven't given them to us.
Okay. Thank you. Next question to any of the panel?
Yeah, actually, to Liz.
To Liz. Another question coming, Liz.
Just a brief follow-up. Do you think Australia was aware that they were not the first choice? Do you think they were aware that Canada was in contention and preferred?
Actually, that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. The material I've seen that is all to do with canvassing possible sites is mostly, in fact, almost entirely on the British side, British documents. I'm not sure, but that's an interesting one. You've made me wonder, so I'm going to see if I can find it out.
Thank you. Tom at the back, I think.
Yep. Just wondered for any of the panel, I came across a story about Australian uranium being transported across the Pacific by one of our naval officers in a clandestine merchant ship. Seems fairly verifiable. Has any of the panel come across that?
Did any of the panel come across uranium being taken across the Pacific by naval officers? No, don't think so.
I can just respond to that. I can't answer your question directly, but I know that there was something like 15 to 2,000 barrels after the first cleanup. They put the atomic waste in 44-gallon drums, and then they were flown to Woomera at Evetts Field, and they only just recently, 2 years ago, you may recall, our state premier organised Kimber to be a low-level waste. That's where those drums from a long time ago ended up. Can I just also say something from a question, from an earlier question? Let's not forget that it is true to say that the British didn't. There was an agreement in principle that they would share atomic and nuclear, research. That didn't happen, but by about 1958, the Australian government did put a lot of pressure on the British to actually, to acquire a nuclear weapon. It didn't happen, and but the reason why it didn't happen was partly got to do with defence reasons. But Menzies always kept an open mind. He would, espouse the fact that Australia was part of the nuclear club, and it was to send a message to Asia that if you muck around with us, there could be nuclear consequences. And let's not forget one other factor, that by the time you get to 1968, Liberal Prime Minister Gorton was seriously entertaining the issue of actually acquiring a nuclear bomb.
Thank you.
So
Young lady had a question.
Oh, thank you.
You have to speak up because my ears are very old.
Right, it's another question for Liz.
For Liz?
I'm afraid. Yeah. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was really great. I just had another follow-up question. How do you differentiate between it being deference, this failure to ask certain questions, deference to the colonial power, and deference to a very dominant leader, i.e. Menzies? How do you differentiate?
Did you get the question? Did you get the question?
Yes, I heard it. Well, Menzies himself was showing deference to the UK.
He wanted to.
With perhaps one exception, with Mosaic G2 in 1956, which was a much bigger weapon, and they had not revealed to Australia just how big that weapon was going to be. And when it created a panic in 1956 because of the size of it, people thought it was a nuclear accident. Menzies, for the one and only time that I can see anyway, during the entire period of the weapons testing in Australia, spoke angrily, wrote angrily to Anthony Eden, who was Prime Minister at that moment. The rest of the time he was showing a fair amount of deference himself, so I think that he led that general approach to the British, which was to basically allow them to do whatever they want and without questioning very much of what they did. There was the creation of the Atomic Weapons Test Safety Committee, which came into being just before Maralinga was commissioned. But that itself became a method of preventing information flowing to the Australian government. And that was something that was looked at in some detail by the Royal Commission. And the person who was the bad guy there was Ernest Titterton, who headed that committee from 1957 onwards until it was disbanded. And so, there's a lot of contention about why Titterton and others were able to get away with keeping the Australian government in the dark. And I think that it comes down to that sense of deference, which Menzies himself embodied.
Thanks, Liz. Question at the back. For anyone on the panel. Liz.
At the times of which you speak, Professor, I know of no other location in Australia which had substantive reserves of uranium except Rum Jungle. Now, it wasn't until much later, with active exploration, mainly by the French and Germans in this country, and I was part of it, that we located, identified, and otherwise examined in every way Narvalik and its two sister licenses in Northern Australia. Where did the uranium come from to supply these tests? Are you contending it was Australian uranium?
Not initially. No, the earlier tests were, and Michael might know this better, but the earlier tests would have come from the Congo and places like that. The early uranium came from there. But later, there was Radium Hill and Rum Jungle and Mary Kathleen and places like that in Australia. So, but no, the first, the Blue Danube, the hurricane weapons and the totem weapons were probably not Australian uranium. Michael, do you know for sure where that uranium came from?
My understanding is that most of that uranium came from the Belgian Congo. In fact, when the Americans dropped the two bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, about a month after that, if you actually do a trove search, it's interesting. There was a journalist who was asking questions of the Chifley government. Did Australia supply any of the uranium for that bomb? And the answer that the government shut it down fairly quickly. It didn't come from Australia. It came from the Belgian Congo. And my understanding is that most of that uranium came
Australian uranium didn't really, come to the vogue till about 1954, when Port Pirie was firmly established as a processing plant.
Okay, thank you. Liz, does that help you?
Indeed, at the time of Operation Totem in 1953, there was a stream of senior British politicians led by Lord Cherwell, but also Duncan Sands came out as well as then Minister of Supply to try and shore up Australian uranium imports to them. So at that time, the Americans were courting Australia for uranium deposits that they wanted. And of course, a lot of the uranium the uranium that was controlled by the West, I suppose you can say, was already locked up into military agreements. So what they were really looking for at that point was uranium for civilian nuclear energy. But there was a huge amount of British interest and a huge amount of British concern that Australia was going to sell its uranium to the Americans. And that was in 1953, and that was very, very linked to Operation Totem and what was happening with Totem at the time. In fact, both those politicians visited Emu Field while they were in Australia for those talks. But they went away kind of empty-handed. Cherwell didn't get exactly what he wanted, and Menzies drove a bit of a harder bargain on uranium than he did with the nuclear tests. So that was pretty interesting.
Maybe the U-235 and U-238 are two different fissionable materials. The reactor, or at least the uranium deposit in Congo, with which I'm familiar, you must know, I'm sure you're alive to the fact it's a natural reactor. The only other deposit in that era that I'm aware of, and I'm reasonably aware of these things, and long experience with the uranium industry, is at Slave Lake in Canada, Manitoba. Now, I frankly, politely, but frankly disagree with a lot of your contentions. And I'm not sure that you've given sufficient evidence to satisfy people who have a deep understanding of it.
About uranium? Well, I think, it's pretty clear that the Congo was supplying a lot of uranium early on, and that the British wanted our uranium, particularly for civilian nuclear energy. Is that something you disagree with?
Look, we may have to pursue that at another time. We have time for one more question before lunch. Yes, at the back. Lunch is in a minute.
I'd like to ask about Lord Cherwell. The Second World War, Lord Cherwell was Winston Churchill's bulldog to stop coastal command getting long-range aircraft. What role did Cherwell play in this scenario that you were talking about now, the panel as a whole?
He was a fierce advocate for the UK going it alone on nuclear weapons development. He didn't trust the Americans, and he was a scientist, of course, and so he had deep knowledge of the technology, and Churchill relied upon him to advise him on how to proceed. And I had the great privilege of spending quite a bit of time at the Cherwell Archive in Oxford, and reading a lot of his correspondence with Churchill. And there's no doubt that he was whipping Churchill up into enthusiasm around a British nuclear weapon. And he was chiding Churchill if he ever looked like he was retreating from such a thing. So he certainly had a huge role, of course, in the Second World War. And he continued behind the scenes with the various bomb-making committees under the Attlee regime, and then he came blazing back once Churchill came back in 1951, and he was, many consider the sort of the animating force behind Churchill, who was, waning somewhat in his strength at that time. But Cherwell was the one who was really driving a lot of this behind the scenes.
it really is now time for us to finish. Andrew has a couple of things to say before we go.
You want to just say thank you?
I'm just about to do that. We'd like to say thank you to all of the panellists here, in particular to Liz, who won't be staying for lunch with us, but we thank you for your time and for your contributions and for your paper. We look forward to catching up with your books. To Peter, to Mike, and to David, and we thank you also for your contributions, your timely contributions, your controversial contributions, and for the knowledge that you brought to us all today. We look forward to discussions over lunch,